Hello, children. Today we're going to be doing some short notes on a skill that will help you improve your writing pretty quickly if you can pick up on it. We're going to be talking about active and passive verbs / active and passive voice. They're kind of the same thing. And I'm going to be talking about this in the same terms that the book, Everything You Need to Know to Ace English Language Arts in One Big Fat Book, talks about it. So even though this is a standard English skill, I kind of use their ideas to frame this lesson, so I'm giving them credit. You do need to take notes on this, so make sure that you are able to show those notes when the video is over. So let's just start by defining active and passive verbs so that you understand what I'm talking about. We'll start with active. So when a verb is active, then it means that the subject of the sentence takes action in that sentence. And I know that's a little bit confusing, but hear me out. Let's look at some examples. So the first example here is this sentence. Mr. Lassard created the lesson on his computer. In this case, the subject of the sentence, the thing that the sentence is about, is Mr. Lassard. And the action that Mr. Lassard is taking is the action of creating. So you can see Mr. Lassard created is an active voice because the verb is directly attached to the subject. We'll look at another example. So this example, the student took notes diligently. In this case, we've got the subject of the sentence, the student, and the action is taking. So the verb took is directly attributed to the subject of the sentence, the student. Finally, we'll look at one last example, this one. Pencils scratched feverishly on paper. Again, we've got the subject of the sentence, pencils, and the action, scratching. So the verb scratched is directly attached to the subject, the pencils. So that's active voice, and it sounds pretty easy, and it also probably sounds like, oh yeah, of course, that makes a ton of sense. However, many times we actually don't do it this way. We do something called passive verbs or passive voice. So when a verb is passive, that means that we attach some form of the verb to be, and different forms of that verb include is, are, were, was, am. We attach some form of that verb to the active verb. So where we don't have the verb to be anywhere in the sentences on the left, if you look at these examples on the right, you can see what I'm talking about, and you'll probably see that you probably do this in your writing or in your speaking. So the first example, if we were to write it in passive voice, might look something like this. The lesson was created by Mr. Lassard. Now, that sentence is fine, but it has this extra verb attached to it. So the verb becomes was, and then we have this kind of secondary verb created there. It also switches the subject. So in this case, instead of the subject being Mr. Lassard, the subject becomes the lesson. And the whole sentence kind of becomes more boring than it was already. Especially since Mr. Lassard is actually the person who's doing the creating, right? Like it switches the thing around. The second sentence might look something like this. So notes were taken diligently by the student. Now again, it's a fine sentence, it works, but it's longer than it needs to be, and it switches the subject around. So instead of the student actually taking the notes are being taken, and that, you know, it's just the student then becomes a passive kind of observer almost in this sentence. The final version of the sentence, or the final version of the third example, looks something like this. Pencils had to be scratched feverishly on the paper. This one, in this case, the subject stays the same, but we added the verb phrase had to be, and then we have the secondary verb scratched. So where scratched is actually the more interesting verb, it takes second seat to this more boring verb phrase had to be. And we don't need the verb phrase had to be. We could have said the sentence without it. So the thing to remember is that active verbs usually, there are some cases where it's not true, but active verbs usually beat passive verbs. And so one way that you can improve your writing is just to think to yourself, like, how do I make this sentence active? What kind of verb can I use? Or can I cut the to be verb out of the sentence to make this sentence more active? And you almost always can. Just remember that active sentences are shorter, they're more interesting, and usually they're more creative as well because you have to find verbs that really describe the action that's being taken. Let's talk about one last thing, and that is keeping our voice consistent. So if you have active voice or if you have passive voice, you want it to be consistent within a sentence. Essentially, if you start a sentence with active verbs, then you want to make sure that it stays that way to the end of the sentence. So if we look at a couple of examples, this first example based on the picture on the right, we've got when the wind blew, Pooh and Piglet were forced to take cover. We've actually got one active verb and then a passive kind of verb phrase there. Blew is the active verb, and then were forced is the passive version of that. If we were to change it to be consistent, it would read something more like this. The wind blew, forcing Pooh and Piglet to take cover. In that case, we just got rid of that extra verb and made the sentence more interesting and more active, more engaging. In the second case, if we start passive, then we probably just want to stay passive. So if we look at this sentence, Pooh is holding Piglet's hand, which keeps the little guy safe. In the first case, it's passive, is holding. So we've attached, a form of to be to holding, and holding becomes secondary. But then keeps is an active verb later on in the sentence. And so if we want to be consistent and we started with passive voice, then we would write it more like this. Pooh is holding Piglet's hand, so he is able to keep the little guy safe. And then you can see how the sentence gets longer and is just a little bit less engaging. The reality is that neither of those two sentences is ideal. You want it to be consistent, but maybe you just want to change the whole thing around to be consistently active. So active voice still wins in this case when we write it like this. Holding Piglet's hand, Pooh keeps the little guy safe. It's shorter, it's more creative, it puts a better picture in your mind, and you just don't have to say as much. So that's something to think about, and it's not a very difficult way to start improving your writing without putting too much time into it. This is a quick fix for improving your writing. So let's see how you can do with some practice.